Jack the Ripper, the mysterious serial killer whose identity has long remained a mystery.
That is.
Until now.
Yeah, DNA from a shawl recovered at the scene of one of his crimes has incredibly found a 100% match.
Over a century passed with fear in the foggy streets of London. A shadow stalked the night, leaving horror in its wake, and the world only knew him as Jack the Ripper.
Serial killers' nicknames come up a lot on this show, but for my money, the best one probably is the first one, Jack the Ripper. Gotta be honest, the name Aaron Kosminski just doesn't have the same impact, doesn't pack the same punch.
For 137 years, he had no face, no name, just terror that authorities couldn't stop. But now, a single piece of fabric, ignored, dismissed, forgotten, has finally revealed the truth. How could such a tiny clue elude investigators for so long? And what does it mean that modern science can finally unmask a killer history couldn't catch? Using DNA analysis, 2 British scientists have not only uncovered his identity, but also exposed a chilling secret authorities tried to bury. Tonight, the case is no longer open. Tonight, history speaks, and it names him.
Before we continue, subscribe and stay curious with us.
Jack the Ripper, exposed. Every great mystery has a single moment where everything shifts. For the Ripper case, that moment came not in a laboratory or a courtroom, but at an auction house in 2007. A man named Russell Edwards, an author and amateur detective who had spent years obsessed with the Whitechapel murders, placed a bid on something most experts had written off as worthless: a stained, tattered silk shawl. This wasn't just any piece of fabric. According to its history, this shawl was recovered from the scene of the Ripper's 4th canonical victim, a woman named Catherine Eddowes, on the night of September 30th, 1888. Has one of the world's most notorious murder mysteries finally been solved? A tiny trace of DNA on a Victorian shawl could hold the key to the true identity of the serial killer known as Jack the Ripper. The story goes that a police officer at the scene, Acting Sergeant Amos Simpson, took it home as a morbid souvenir. It had been passed down through his family ever since, stored away, forgotten, dismissed by serious researchers as just another piece of Ripper memorabilia in a market flooded with fakes. But Edwards saw something different. He saw potential. He saw the one thing that Victorian investigators could never have imagined. He saw DNA. You have to understand what Edwards was up against. This shawl was over 120 years old at the time he acquired it. It had been handled by countless people. It had been exposed to the elements, to dust, to time itself. The idea that any usable genetic material could survive on it seemed almost laughable. But Edwards wasn't laughing. He was hunting. He took his gamble to one of the most respected genetic researchers in the world, Dr. Jari Luonen at Liverpool John Moore University. Dr. Luonen specializes in extracting genetic information from ancient, degraded samples, the kind of work that most scientists consider nearly impossible, the kind of work that requires patience measured in years and precision measured in molecules. The team began their analysis in a sterile laboratory environment, focusing on the visible stains that mark the fabric. What they were looking for was something called mitochondrial DNA, or mtDNA. Now, this is where science gets fascinating, so stay with me here. Most people know that your DNA is a combination of genetic material from both your parents, but mitochondrial DNA is different. It exists outside the nucleus of your cells, in tiny structures called mitochondria. And here's the crucial part. You inherit your mtDNA exclusively from your mother. She inherited it from her mother, and so on, stretching back through an unbroken female line for thousands of years. This DNA doesn't mix or recombine like regular DNA. It passes down virtually unchanged from generation to generation. Why does this matter? Because it means that if you can find a living descendant of someone's maternal line, their mtDNA should match, even after 137 years, even if the original sample is degraded beyond what anyone thought possible. The first test was straightforward but essential. Was this shawl even real? Had it actually been at the crime scene? The team tracked down a living descendant of Catherine Eddowes' sister. They took a DNA sample. They compared it to the genetic material extracted from the bloodstains on the shawl. It matched. The shawl was genuine. It had been present at the murder scene, soaked in the victim's blood on that terrible night in 1888. But the scientists found something else. Mixed in with Catherine Eddowes' blood were other biological traces, samples consistent with semen. This was the genetic signature of the perpetrator himself, left behind in his moment of violence. Now the hunt had a target. Edwards and the research team had a prime suspect in mind, a name that had appeared in the original police files, a name that senior investigators had whispered about for over a century. They tracked down a living female line descendant of this suspect's sister. They obtained a sample. They ran the comparison. The results came back positive. A match. After 137 years of mystery, speculation, and obsession, science pointed to one man, and his name was Aaron Kosminski.
The name is Aaron Kosminski. He was a Polish immigrant Jew that came over to Whitechapel in 1881 with his brother. And he was 23 at the age of the murders.
The ordinary evil. Here's where most people expect a dramatic reveal. They expect to learn that Jack the Ripper was someone famous, a brilliant surgeon with a god complex, a deranged artist, a member of the royal family hiding a dark secret. The conspiracy theories have been endless. Queen Victoria's own grandson, Prince Albert Victor, has been accused. Freemasons orchestrating elaborate cover-ups, mad doctors, and aristocratic perverts. But the truth is far more unsettling in its ordinariness. Aaron Kosminski was nobody special. He was a 23-year-old Polish-Jewish immigrant who worked as a hairdresser in the heart of Whitechapel. He wasn't a phantom. He wasn't a genius. He was a deeply disturbed young man who lived and worked in the exact neighborhood where the murders occurred, and the police knew exactly who he was. Kosminski had fled Poland, then part of the Russian Empire, to escape the brutal pogroms that targeted Jewish communities. He arrived in London with his family in the early 1880s and settled in the East End. By all contemporary accounts, he was mentally unwell. Modern psychiatric experts who have reviewed the historical records believe he suffered from paranoid schizophrenia. He experienced auditory hallucinations. He had violent outbursts. And according to the police officers who investigated him, he harbored a profound and dangerous hatred of women. This isn't speculation. This isn't modern profiling applied retroactively. This is what the actual investigators believed at the time. While the newspapers whipped the public into a frenzy over theatrical letters and theories about educated killers, the senior officers on the case were quietly building their own list of suspects, and Aaron Kosminski's name sat at the very top. Chief Constable Melville McNaughton wrote an internal memorandum in 1894 that explicitly named Kosminski as a primary suspect. He described him as having a great hatred of women and strong homicidal tendencies. But the most damning evidence comes from someone even closer to the investigation. Chief Inspector Donald Swanson was the man who oversaw the entire Ripper investigation. He coordinated every lead, every interview, every piece of evidence. He was there on the ground every single day. Years after he retired, Swanson obtained a copy of his superior's memoirs about the case, and in the margins of that book, in his own handwriting, Swanson scribbled a private note that would remain hidden for decades. He wrote that the perpetrator was Kosminski, that Kosminski had been sent to an asylum, that he had died there. Think about what this means. The officer in charge of the most infamous murder investigation in British history privately confirmed the killer's identity. He wrote it down, and then that confirmation was buried in the pages of a book that wouldn't be discovered until long after everyone involved was dead. The circumstantial evidence is overwhelming. Kosminski lived in the immediate vicinity of all the murder locations. He was known to be violent and mentally unstable. He matched the general descriptions provided by the few witnesses who claimed to have seen the Ripper. And then there's the timeline. In 1891, Kosminski's family finally had him committed to Coal Hatch Lunatic Asylum. He would remain institutionalized for the rest of his life, eventually dying in 1919. And when did the Jack the Ripper murders stop? They stopped in 1891, the moment Aaron Kosminski was removed from the streets of Whitechapel. The DNA evidence, the police testimony, the geographic profile, the psychiatric history, the timeline, Every single thread leads to the same man. 1888, the year Whitechapel died. But to truly understand this case, you cannot focus solely on the killer. You have to understand the world that created him, the London that bred him, the nightmare that was Whitechapel in 1888. Forget everything you think you know about Victorian England. Forget the elegant carriages and the refined gentlemen in top hats. That London existed, certainly, but it existed in the West End, where the wealthy lived in grand houses and attended glittering balls. The East End was something else entirely. The East End was hell on earth. Whitechapel in 1888 was one of the most densely populated, desperately poor, and hopelessly diseased places in the entire world. Over 900,000 people were crammed into a few square miles of narrow streets, dark alleys, and crumbling tenements. We're talking about population densities that would make modern slums look spacious. Over 1,000 people per acre in some areas. The air itself was poisonous. London's famous fog wasn't a romantic mist. It was a thick, yellow, choking smog created by the smoke from thousands of coal fires, mixing with the damp air from the Thames. They called it pea soup fog, and on bad nights it was so dense you literally could not see your own hand in front of your face. Street lamps were useless. The darkness was absolute. For a predator, it was perfect cover. There was no social safety net. No welfare, no unemployment insurance. If you couldn't pay for a bed, you slept in the streets, and sleeping in the streets in Whitechapel often meant you didn't wake up. The center of this misery was the common lodging house, known as a doss house. These were filthy, overcrowded establishments where you could rent a bed for 4 pence a night. If you couldn't afford 4 pence, you could rent a coffin, which was exactly what it sounds like, a coffin-shaped wooden box where you could sleep in a slightly more protected position. If you couldn't afford even that, some places offered a rope strung across the room that you could lean on and sleep standing up. This is what survival looked like in Whitechapel. This is what the Ripper's victims faced every single day of their lives. The 5 women who are generally accepted as the Ripper's canonical victims were not glamorous figures. They were not young. They were not beautiful by the standards of their time. Mary Ann Nichols was 43. Annie Chapman was 47. Elizabeth Stride was 44. Catherine Eddowes was 46. Mary Jane Kelly, the youngest, was about 25. They were women who had fallen through every crack in society. Women who had lost husbands, lost families, lost hope. Women who walked the streets of Whitechapel in the fog and the darkness, desperate to earn the few pennies they needed for a bed that night. They weren't looking for adventure. They weren't taking risks for excitement. They were trying to survive one more night. And that desperation made them vulnerable. It made them trust strangers they should have run from. It made them follow men into dark corners because the alternative was sleeping in an alley where anything could happen anyway. The Ripper didn't need to be clever. He didn't need to be charming. He just needed to be local. He needed to know the streets, the alleys, the escape routes. He needed to find women desperate enough to take a chance. And in Whitechapel in 1888, those women were everywhere. Fear in the fog. With the city screaming for answers and the newspapers publishing increasingly hysterical headlines, the London Metropolitan Police launched one of the largest manhunts in British history. They flooded Whitechapel with officers. They conducted over 2,000 interviews. They detained and questioned at least 80 men. They followed every lead, no matter how ridiculous. So why did they fail to catch him? Why did Aaron Kosminski continue to walk free until his family finally had him committed? The answer lies in the impossible circumstances the police faced. They weren't just fighting a killer, they were fighting the limitations of their entire era. There was no such thing as forensic science in 1888. The concept barely existed. When a body was discovered, there was no crime scene tape, no careful documentation, no evidence collection protocols. Crowds would rush in. Reporters would trample through. The scene would be contaminated within minutes of discovery. The police had no fingerprinting technology. That wouldn't be developed until the 1890s. They had no way to analyze blood types. They had no understanding of trace evidence. All they could rely on were witness descriptions, and those descriptions were almost useless. Different witnesses described the Ripper as tall and short, shabby and respectable, young and middle-aged. In the fog and the darkness of Whitechapel, no one could agree on what they had seen. Here's the truly maddening part. The police did find evidence, they just didn't know what to do with it. Near the scene of Catherine Eddowes' murder, the same victim whose blood stained the shawl, officers found a piece of her apron. It had been cut away and discarded by the killer. On the wall above it, someone had written a message in chalk. The words read, "The Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing." Was this a message from the killer? Was Kosminski, who was Jewish, attempting to deflect blame onto his own community? Or was it simply random anti-Semitic graffiti completely unconnected to the crime? We will never know, because Sir Charles Warren, the commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, was so afraid the message would incite anti-Jewish riots that he ordered it erased immediately, before it could be photographed, before it could be analyzed. The police literally washed away one of the only pieces of physical evidence they ever found. And then there were the letters. The Ripper case became the first true media sensation of the modern era, and it happened because of a letter that arrived at a London news agency in late September 1888. The letter taunted the police, promised more murders, and was signed with the theatrical name that would echo through history, Jack the Ripper. The problem? Almost every serious researcher now believes that letter was a fake, most likely written by a journalist at a London newspaper to sell more copies. But it worked. It created a global frenzy. It gave the killer a brand, an identity, a mythology, and it sent the police chasing thousands of copycat letters while the real killer continued his work. But one letter was different. One letter was almost certainly genuine. It arrived at the home of George Lusk, the head of the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee, a group of local businessmen who had organized to patrol the streets. The letter came in a small cardboard box. Inside that box was half of a preserved human kidney. The letter, written in a cruder hand than the theatrical Dear Boss correspondence, claimed the kidney had been taken from one of the victims. And indeed, Catherine Eddowes had her kidney removed during her murder. The kidney was examined by a physician at the time who confirmed it was human and showed signs of Bright's disease, a kidney condition. Catherine Eddowes was known to have suffered from kidney problems. This was real evidence, a direct link to the killer, and it led nowhere. The police had no way to definitively prove the kidney belonged to Eddowes. They had no way to trace where it came from. They had the killer's taunt in their hands, and they could do nothing with it.
DNA via Jack the Ripper. When Dr. Llewellyn and his team published their findings in the Journal of Forensic Sciences in 2019, they didn't just make a claim. They presented rigorous scientific evidence that had been subjected to peer review and repeated testing. The methodology was straightforward but painstaking. First, they needed to establish that the shawl was genuine. That meant proving it had actually been present at the murder scene. By obtaining mtDNA from a living descendant of Catherine Eddowes' sister and matching it to the DNA in the bloodstains, they confirmed the shawl's authenticity beyond reasonable doubt. But proving the shawl was real was only the first step. The crucial evidence was the other biological material found on the fabric. The samples are consistent with the killer's genetic signature. The team extracted this material and sequenced its mtDNA. Then they obtained a sample from a living descendant of Aaron Kosminski's sister. Remember, mitochondrial DNA passes unchanged through the maternal line. If the mtDNA from the shawl matched the mtDNA from Kosminski's maternal descendants, it would mean the biological material almost certainly came from someone in Kosminski's direct maternal line. It matched. The researchers were careful not to overstate their findings. They acknowledged the limitations of working with degraded samples. They discussed the possibility of contamination. But they concluded that the evidence strongly supported the identification of Aaron Kosminski as the source of the biological material on the shawl. This wasn't a perfect smoking gun. Ancient DNA analysis never is. But combined with the historical evidence, with the police testimony, with the geographic and psychological profile, with the timeline of Kosminski's institutionalization matching the end of the murders, the case becomes overwhelming. Of course, not everyone agrees. Science progresses through debate, and the Ripper case has generated more debate than almost any other historical mystery. Critics have raised legitimate concerns.
The shawl changed hands many times before it ever reached a laboratory. How can we be certain the DNA wasn't deposited by someone else along the way? The sample was degraded. Could there have been errors in the analysis? These are fair questions, but they don't invalidate the findings. They simply acknowledge the inherent limitations of historical forensic analysis. No cold case from 1888 will ever be solved with the same certainty as a modern crime with fresh evidence. What we have is the best answer we are likely to ever get, and that answer points to Aaron Kosminski.
Law via lunacy. If the police knew Kosminski was their man, why didn't they arrest him? Why was he allowed to continue walking the streets of Whitechapel until his family committed him to an asylum? The answer lies in the legal standards of the Victorian era. Knowing someone was guilty and proving it in court were two entirely different things. The police had suspicion, they had circumstantial evidence, they had witnesses who had seen a man matching Kosminski's description in the vicinity of the crimes, but they had nothing that would stand up in court. One witness reportedly identified Kosminski in a lineup, but refused to testify against a fellow Jew. Without that testimony, without forensic evidence, without a confession, the police had no case. They could watch him, they could follow him, they could wait for him to make a mistake, but they couldn't arrest him. And then, before any of that mattered, Kosminski's mental condition deteriorated to the point where his family sought to have him institutionalized. He was committed in 1891. The murders stopped. For the police, the case was effectively closed, even if it could never be officially solved. There's a bitter irony in all of this. The Ripper was never caught because of brilliant deduction or tireless police work. He was stopped because his own madness consumed him. The same mental illness that drove him to murder eventually made it impossible for him to function in society. His family did what the police could not. And then, the legend took over. In the absence of an official solution, the case became a canvas for every conspiracy theory, every wild speculation, every romanticized notion of the brilliant criminal mastermind. Jack the Ripper became a phantom precisely because the real answer was so unsatisfying. A mentally ill immigrant hairdresser doesn't sell books. A secret society of aristocratic murderers does. The fog that hid Jack the Ripper has finally lifted, but the questions it leaves behind are far from settled. How many of history's monsters have walked in plain sight, hiding behind the limits of their time? And how many truths are still waiting for science to uncover, buried in shadows or dismissed as impossible? Aaron Kosminski may close one chapter, but the pursuit of justice, the search for understanding, and the uncovering of secrets that challenge everything we thought we knew, it's just beginning. What other mysteries of the past are waiting for the right mind, the right technology to bring them into the light? And perhaps the most unsettling question of all, what secrets are still watching us from the shadows, waiting for their moment to be revealed?
Amazing discoveries. Make sure to subscribe and hit the bell icon. Share this video with friends and join the discussion on what these findings could mean. Your thoughts and questions are important, so let's explore incredible mysteries together.